know, I use vibrato sometimes in reels. I do. I'll admit it. Hey fiddlers, welcome to today's fiddle video. Today we're going to be talking about how to make your reels sound less violin-y and more fiddly. So less like this. And more like this. Today I will walk you through 5 tips for this, and if you'd like me to go in depth on any one of them in a future video, please let me know in the comments. The tune I'm going to be using to demonstrate these ideas today is a traditional Irish reel called Sporting Paddy. I did a tutorial on that tune in another video, which I will link to in the description. Okay, so tip number 1 is to add some swing to your playing. So here's what the A part of Sporting Paddy would sound like without swing. And here it is with swing. Alright, so what is swing? The basic idea of swing is that you're giving eighth notes a little bit of a long, short, long, short, long, short rhythm. So in slow motion, instead of going, you're going. So that's a long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. Different fiddle players will use differing degrees of swing. So you might have some musicians who barely use it at all, and then others who use a ton. I think I fall somewhere in the middle. I try not to really overdo it, but I also don't want to just play all the notes evenly. So rather than this, or I like to play it something like this. Tip number 2 is to look at your bowing patterns, and there are some that I very commonly use in fiddle tunes and some that really rarely I find come up. This might be a more violinish way of bowing the A part of the tune. And this might be a more fiddly way. The main difference is that the first time I was bowing those eighth notes in sets of 2 or 4, and the second time in the fiddly version, I was using something I like to call 3-3-2 bowing. Because reels are in 4-4 time, or maybe you might think of it as 2-2 time or 2-4 time, it's very tempting to divide things into 2s and 4s. If you were doing one bow for each pair of eighth notes or each quarter note, this is what that would be like. If you were doing one bow per 4 eighth notes, or the equivalent, this is what that would sound like. But here's what it sounds like when you do that 3-3-2 bowing. What I mean by 3-3-2 bowing is that in each measure, when you have 8 eighth notes, you're playing 3 separate, down, up, down, 3 slurred, and 2 separate. You might also do 3-3-2 bowing with 3 slurred, 2 separate. That's another way to do it. In some measures in this tune, you have some quarter notes that can fit into that slur. This is one of many fiddle bowing patterns you might encounter. I particularly love this one. I use it in reels all the time. It creates a kind of cool texture, kind of this smooth and sometimes choppy sound. It also helps with, when you're playing with swing, making up for all those longer notes that were on down bows. Here's what I mean by that. When you're playing, you're starting to move towards the end of your bow, and then you can slur the next 3. So it kind of helps you budget your bow. There are other fiddle slurring patterns that you might really enjoy. One is called the Georgia Shuffle, and it sounds a little something like this. You might encounter that more in old-time tunes or bluegrass tunes, but I use it in Irish tunes sometimes too. You might also sometimes find a 1 down, 3 up slurring pattern, which uses 1 down bow on the first 8th note instead of 4, and an up bow for the next 3 8th notes. Another thing these slurring patterns can do is help you create a particular emphasis on certain notes in the tune, which brings us to tip number 3, which is to use emphasis wisely. Here's the A part of the tune without emphasis on particular beats. And here it is with a little emphasis on the offbeat. Okay, so if we think of reels in 4/4 time, we're thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. We might tap our feet or snap our fingers on the 1 and the 3 and think of those as the downbeats. And you could emphasize that downbeat like this. But you could also emphasize the 2 and the 4, which are between the foot taps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's what that might sound like. In reels, I like to kind of switch back and forth between those 2 forms of emphasis and probably lean a little bit more towards the 2 and the 4. Fiddle bowings like 3/3-2 bowing and the Georgia shuffle can really help you create that offbeat emphasis. This is because often you'll have a down bow on those notes followed by and or preceded by a slower up bow that slurs 3 notes. And that down bow is very strong because you have to move your bow pretty quickly to get farther along so you have more room for the up bow. Here's what I mean by that. In the 3/3-2 bowing, you go 3 separate, and then to kind of get ready for that up bow, you might do a quicker down bow, and then a slower up bow on the 3-note slur, and then another quick down bow to make up for the distance you covered on the slur. In the Georgia shuffle, you have down bows on the 2s and 4s and up bow slurs for all the other notes. That can make those down bows even stronger. The 1 down, 3 up slurring pattern, by contrast, would emphasize the downbeat of the tune. One note on all of this is that I like to mix up my bowing patterns. Generally, and I break this rule sometimes, but I don't tend to stay in one bowing pattern for a really long time in the tune, like Georgia shuffle all the way through or 3/3-2 all the way through, even though I might at times. This kind of keeps things interesting in terms of the emphasis, the texture of the tune, all of that. And now we come to tip number 4, which is to incorporate ornamentation into your tune. Ornamentation can take many different forms. You might use slides, you might use grace notes. Here is what the B part of the tune would sound like without ornamentation. And here it is with some ornamentation. What I'm doing there is I'm adding some slides and some grace note ornaments to some of the downbeat notes of the tune. So maybe something like this. Grace note ornament on this note. That's called a mordant, where you play the principal note, the note above, and back to the principal note, all really quickly at the beginning of the note. Then going on, a little slide up to your third finger here, hopefully in tune. Then going on, mordant, slide, there's something about adding an ornament to some key notes in the tune rather than just landing directly on that note that makes it more fiddly. Instead of, you've got And now we've arrived at tip number 5, our final tip of the day, which I hesitate to even say because I'm probably gonna get a lot of mail. This is try to avoid vibrato when you're playing a reel. In general. I know, I use vibrato sometimes in reels. I do. I'll admit it. But it's probably not the most fiddly aspect of my playing. Take this one with a grain of salt because it may depend on what fiddling tradition you are coming from, but here is the B part of the tune with a fair amount of vibrato. And now without vibrato. I know that if you come from a classical background, it can be really hard to take the vibrato out of your playing, but I'm telling you, it's worth trying. After all that time you put in developing your vibrato, now I'm telling you not to do it. I will say, I think it can sound really nice on some of the longer notes in the tune. And if you're playing a fiddle tune that's sort of a slow waltzy air or something like that, very often it's a little more appropriate to add it in those situations. A corollary to this is that if you've studied classical violin, you might have been trying to avoid playing too many open strings. And maybe that's so you can add some vibrato, or it's just for tone reasons or whatever. In fiddle music, very often we just go for it. We just play the open strings. If it's there, we'll play it. One of the joys of fiddling is that sometimes we just take the easy way out. All right, fiddlers, that wraps up today's video. I hope you found this helpful. And again, if you would like to learn the tune that I use to demonstrate these ideas, it's called Sporting Patty. I did a tutorial video on that, which I'll link to in the description. Have a wonderful day, happy fiddling, and I'll see you soon.